Okay.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته واقتفى هديه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا، وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وبعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
Today, inshallah, we'll continue with the topics of the Sunnah. At the last lecture, we started talking about examples of the writing or the documentation of the Sunnah from the time of the Prophet ﷺ on till the year or the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, during which the official documentation of the Sunnah based on the order from Umar bin Abdul Aziz radiallahu anhu, the Sunnah was compiled and documented. And we want to reiterate again that many hadith, many companions, for that matter, wrote multiple or hundreds of hadith during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That's on top of what they have memorized. These hadith were passed on during the time of the Khulafa, Rashidin, and the Tabi'in. Just want to highlight one point here that we did not address in detail, that during the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, there was an opinion to start writing the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and give it special attention, and just like they did with the Quran during the time of Abu Bakr, to do it with the Sunnah. But Umar radiallahu anhu did not go for that opinion. And the reason was he didn't want to distract people from the Quran and didn't want to confuse the Sunnah of the Quran. The focus was obviously the Quran. And during that time, the time of the Khulafa, these Khalifas, and the generations to follow, the art of a transmission of the Sunnah started. That was even during the time of the Sahaba, while the Prophet ﷺ was alive. Remember when we said, like, people would alternate, for example, Umar with his neighbor, when they work, each one would go to work one day while the other goes and attend the session of the Prophet ﷺ, and then they meet after sundown, and then they teach each other what they've heard from the Prophet ﷺ. Also, Anas said, like, they'll be sitting with the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet would leave for a while for whatever reason, and then there'll be 50, 60 people in the majlis, and they will study the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Also, the Sahaba would go to one another, ask about the hadith. So that was already started. So during the time of the Khulafa, this was more intensified effort. Why? Because now the Sahaba want to spread the hadith of the Prophet. It has to be known, though, that there were very strict criteria on accepting these hadith. And that was the beginning of verification of the hadith part. And Umar, for example, would ask for witnesses. When someone tells them, I heard this from the Prophet ﷺ, he said, you have to bring me witnesses. And we had two groups of the Sahaba. Some, which are called the minimalists, basically, would be very sparse in narrating the hadith of the Prophet. Reason is they were very cautious. They didn't want to say anything that is false, and they didn't have probably the right audience. They didn't want to make people confuse the hadith with the Quran. Example, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. You don't have too many hadith narrated after Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, right? On the other hand, there were other companions who were more spreading to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, because they wanted to make sure that this knowledge goes to everyone. And obviously, these companions probably lived longer and traveled more places to allow them to give the hadith. Example is Abu Hurairah. Same thing, Anas bin Malik, Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, Aisha radiallahu anha. And all these people, would know who is giving the hadith. So they wouldn't just give it to anyone. It has to be someone who is reliable also to take the hadith of the Prophet. So I just wanted to highlight this point. Throughout the years, people were documenting and writing the hadith. And again, there was no basis of, or no certain classification, to be precise, of writing these the hadith. Whatever hadith comes, they would just write it, right? And we mentioned that the first person who did massive effort in combining the hadith was the Wali of Egypt at that time. That was Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, right? And that was in about the year 85 of Hijrah. Later on, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, the son of Abdul Aziz bin Marwan, had the honor, when he became the Khalifa, to have an official order, and he wrote a letter to Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. He was at that time the mayor of Medina, to combine all the hadith. And we mentioned specifically the name of the scholar woman, that was Amratu bint Abd al-Rahman, who happened to be the aunt actually of Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. So she was related to him. And Amra, we mentioned specifically that she took the hadith of Aisha. She was the student of Aisha radiallahu anha. So she took all the knowledge and the hadith. And that was the massive effort guided by Ibn Shuhab al-Zuhri. Ibn Shuhab al-Zuhri was the head of that effort, radiallahu anhu. And Ibn Shuhab al-Zuhri is known to be Amirul Mu'mineen fil Hadith, like the prince of the believers in the Hadith. He reached such a high level of authenticity in tracking the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to deserve that opinion. All that, again, was not a classified hadith based on what we know. During the time of Abdul Aziz, they had, okay, this is the hadith of Abu Hurairah. But it wasn't really a modern way of classifying the hadith. Soon after, people started, when the fiqh started, people want to know, okay, we want to learn about divorce. We want to learn about trading. We want to learn about this. So that's when scholars said, okay, how about we start classifying the hadith based on these topics? And that was the first effort, actually, of here are all the hadith related to divorce. And that was actually Ash-Sha'bi. He wrote a book, the hadith of divorce. That was the first effort, and that was in the year of 104. So we mentioned that Umar bin Abdul Aziz radiallahu anhu came to Khilafah in the year of 98 of Hijrah. And that's when he had the order to compile the hadith. So only a few years after that, Al-Sha'bi, rahimahullah, came to that idea, okay, I want to start doing this. Many scholars obviously started doing the same thing, right? But again, it wasn't really a comprehensive effort. Okay? The very first book that we know that came to a very well classified book was Muwatta al-Imam Malik. Muwatta al-Imam Malik. Malik, the famous scholar of fiqh, he was a muhaddith, he was also a tabi'i. And the tabi'i, what's the definition of the tabi'i? Is the one who saw the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. So the tabi'in, which is the followers, basically are the students of the Sahaba. These are the people who basically the second layer, the second generation to follow the Prophet. Later on, many books based on different criteria were written and classified. This is inshallah what we're going to talk about today. So there is about different, or actually countless ways of writing these books of the hadith or classifying these books of the hadith. So now the hadith is memorized, the hadith is already written, but now how do we classify it to present it to people? So they can study it, memorize it, or teach it, right? So each scholar had different idea. Some scholars said, okay, all what I want to put in my book are the authentic, the sahih of hadith after the Prophet ﷺ. And I'm going to put these hadith that make a comprehensive collection to address all matters of religion. And that's called al-Jami', comprehensive collection. And the examples of that, Sahih al-Bukhari wa Sahih al-Muslim. Sahih al-Bukhari اسمه الصحيح المختصر الجامع لأحاديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وسيرته وأيامه. So that's the title. The comprehensive in terms addresses all matters of faith. And again, synopsis, meaning only a selection, okay, of the hadith, authentic of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his seerah, his life, and ayyami, meaning his battles. Right?
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
So that was Sahih al-Bukhari, which we're going to talk about in details in a little bit. And then Muslim, who was also a student of Bukhari, followed the same path, did something similar. Then other scholars said, okay, we want to actually just have a selection of the hadith. Doesn't talk about everything, just about fiqh, the chapters of fiqh. And these are what they call kutub sunan, the books that address the sunan. The sunan meaning, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, classified based on the fiqh. We talk about wudu, talk about salah, hajj, and the rituals the Prophet ﷺ did. And these are Abu Dawud, الترمذي, النسائي, وابن ماجه. We're going to talk briefly about these inshallah as well. النسائي, then Ibn Majah. And then some other people said, okay, I'm going to actually classify the hadith not based on topics, based on the Sahaba, on the companions who narrated these hadith. Right? I'm going to classify the books of the hadith. Okay, what Abu Hurairah narrated, just list all his hadith, regardless of what topic. You would have first hadith about marriage, second hadith about Hajj, third hadith about the description of the Prophet ﷺ, without specific topic classification, right? And these are the musnad. Musnad meaning to render it to the companion, to ascribe it to the companion. That's what sanad musnad means, right? To render it to its narrator of the companions. And the biggest example of this is Musnadul Imam Ahmad. So that is the biggest example. And there are many Musnad as well. There are like Musannafat and Mustakhrajat and Mustadrakat, so many kind of variations. Okay? And even till now, there's countless way of doing this, right? Now you have a book, all hadith related to women, for example, right? Some books, all hadith related just to the battles of the Prophet, something about children. And people, alhamdulillah, keep coming up with creative ways of teaching the Sunnah of the Prophet and meeting the needs of people, right? So let's talk briefly about each of these. I'm going to start with Al-Muwatta because it was the first, or at least one of the very first books of the Hadith to be classified. And Al-Muwatta, what it means, the Al-Muwatta, the facilitated one. Tawti'ah meaning to make it easy, right? It's like Hadith made easy. This is exactly what it means. Hadith made easy. Subhanallah, that is an Imam Malik. And an Imam Malik, as you know, was one of the very most prominent scholars actually of this Ummah. From the time of the Prophet ﷺ till the end of time. He was a tabi'i. He was born in the year of 91 of Hijrah. So he still saw many other companions. And he died in about 175. So he lived very long life, mashallah, 86, 87 years, more or less. And he was the Imam al-Madinah, Faqih al-Madinah. So he grew up, studied, lived in the Medina of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's where he had the honor to meet all these companions. And he started on very early. Now, all these companions, all these scholars started very early. They grew up drinking hadith like they're drinking milk. And now you'll see later when we talk about Imam Ahmad, how early on he started actually with this. So, as we mentioned before, I gave you an example of how respectful the Imam Malik was to the hadith. Imam Malik, before he would go to the session to teach people about the hadith, he would take a shower, best clothes, perfume, like you do for a party. Why? Because he's teaching the hadith of the Prophet. When he walked in the Medina, he's always barefoot. You know why? He doesn't want to step on a place where the foot of the Prophet ﷺ has landed. SubhanAllah. That's why we talk Imam Malik. This is not something just happened. Okay? You see how much appreciation he had, how much esteem he had to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and how much iman he had in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Allah said, and whoever esteems the rituals, the signs of Allah, then it's indeed a sign of the piety of the hearts. That was Imam Malik. So he wrote this book, Muwatta, meaning made easy, and it has about 800 some hadith. And he thought this is the basic synopsis of what a regular, ordinary Muslim should know. And he only had in it the authentic hadith. So how is it different from what Bukhari and Muslim did? He also added some of the statements of the companions and the other tabi'in. Whereas the collection of Bukhari and Muslim, it was purely what has been narrated after the Prophet ﷺ. So mujarrad, meaning pure, only what belonged to the Prophet ﷺ they had. Of course, Imam Malik, because he thought there is benefit in doing that, he added that. So this is why it is different. Now we move on to see what Al-Imam al-Bukhari did and what Al-Imam Muslim did. So Imam al-Bukhari, radiyallahu anhu, was, as you know, the top scholar of hadith throughout history, till the end of time. Allahu A'lam. And he had his book, we call it As-Sahih al-Jami', meaning comprehensive collection. Comprehensive meaning addressing all the topics of religion. And that's what scholars said, in order to be called Jami', it has to address all the matters of faith. It consisted of 97 chapters. And started with the chapter of Bad'ul Wahy, the beginning of revelation. That basically would signal the beginning of Fitan. Scholars said in order for a book to be comprehensive, it has to consist at least of 8 actually different topics. That is the Aqidah, the matters of belief, Al-Ahkam, the laws, then As-Siyar, meaning the life of the Prophet ﷺ, Al-Manaqib, also the virtues of the Prophet ﷺ, As-Sunnah, meaning the descriptive hadith about the rituals of the Prophet ﷺ, and Al-Fitan, meaning the tribulations that's going to happen. So Imam al-Bukhari collected that in 97 chapters. And he spent about 16 years writing it. He started learning the hadith when he was 10-year-old. Imagine. When he was 16-year-old, he started actually going out, traveling to different countries in order to collect hadith. And also at that time, when he was 16, he was already mature enough to teach the hadith to other people. So he had 100,000 hadith that are authentic. And he said, I've selected in this collection only the authentic hadith, and what I left out, much more. But again, he wanted just to give you a small synopsis of what considered comprehensive collection of the matters of Iman. And what he would do, in order to select that hadith, he would keep making istikhara and discussing it with the scholars of his time, give their approval. Then he would have a ghusl, take a bath, and then he writes it. Imagine this intense effort, subhanAllah. And that's why a lot of people, when they say about this hadith, well, how about you first make a ghusl and istikhara and come back talk to us first? Right? Because this is how this hadith was written in Sahih al-Bukhari. So before you have any objection about it, let's at least start there. Right? So he collected in that book about 700, maybe 7,500, between 7,000 to 8,000. And there is a reason of that variation, because many of these hadith were repetitive, redundant. Why he would mention a hadith and let's say tahara, but it could be related to Hajj, he would repeat it again. So there are many scholars who try to just say what is the unrepeated, and it's about maybe 2,500, 2,600, 2,400, depending on how you're counting. Because some hadith could be narrated differently, maybe even by one word. But 2,500 is the straightforward, about 7,500 more or less with the repeated hadith.
Out of 100,000.
He said that collection, the 7,500, out of 100,000 authentic hadith he had, right? So when he wrote in the introduction, I've only selected few, and what I have left out of the authentic is much more, which goes up to 100,000 hadith, out of 600,000 hadith he had. He still had many other books, very famous actually, like Al-Adab al-Mufrad, Al-Tarikh al-Kabir, many other books, which is different classification. Al-Adab al-Mufrad is beautiful actually book, subhanAllah, it's very enjoyable. But again, in Sahih al-Bukhari, he only had a purely authentic, only what the Prophet ﷺ said, in a certain classification, 97 chapters from A to Z. What thought, okay, you read this all what you need to know about the Imam. The book of the Bukhari was again approved by his contemporary scholars and all scholars after that. This is what's considered the most authentic book after the book of Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now you see what effort was put forth in order to put it together, subhanAllah. And Allah chose this person who basically had this special iman, special dedication, special devotion to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imam al-Bukhari was born in the year 194, and he lived about 62, 63 years, which, subhanAllah, the exact age of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. That's the precision of following the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So Allah gave him that honor. That honor, I'm going to give you a story, didn't happen to everyone, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, as you know, lived 61, 62, 63, more or less, depending on how you count. Abu Bakr lived the same age, right? And Umar lived the same age, subhanAllah. That shows you this is selection from Allah, right? Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, radiallahu anhu, when he was 63, he was talking to people, and he was feeling that his end is near. He's telling the Prophet ﷺ lived 63, Abu Bakr lived 63, Umar lived 63, and I'm now 63, meaning it's close. So he lived 13 more years. It's not a wish, right? This is something that Allah has to bring to you. So when you read the Bukhari, lived what the Prophet ﷺ lived, that's his precise following and adherence to the hadith, right? The effort that he gave to the Prophet's hadith, like no one else ever in history, from before until the end of time. Right? So, and again, this is just an additional, subhanAllah, template to show you how devoted he was. Like, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي. Even his death was based on the Sunnah of the Prophet. 10 years after he was born, 194, in 204, Imam Muslim was born, and he was a student of Imam al-Bukhari. And he did similar effort in compiling the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as a Sahih al-Jami', also Sahih Muslim. And Sahih Muslim was, it took about 15 years. Similar criteria of the authenticity. It has to be only what the Prophet ﷺ said. He excluded out the statements of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, because that's what he meant. Only what the Prophet ﷺ said. Followed the highest level of authenticity, avoided repetition as much as possible, and he had about 12,000 hadith. and without repetition, it's about 7,000 to 8,000 hadith. Many of what you have in the book of Muslim also was in the book of Bukhari. That's why later on some scholars said, okay, let's have what both Bukhari and Muslim have narrated, and that's what they had. اللؤلؤ والمرجان فيما اتفق عليه الشيخان. This is one of the actually very first books that we studied, اللؤلؤ والمرجان. Everyone had to know what اللؤلؤ والمرجان. The pearls and the coral of the hadith. What are those? Basically, is what the two sheikhs, Al-Imam al-Bukhari, have agreed on, basically both included in their books, because that gives them a special value. These are the most authentic hadith and most beneficial, most important. Why? Because when they both agreed, we have to put this hadith in the book, that means it's special. So Al-Lu'lu' wal-Murjan, and it's translated to English, by the way. You can find it online easily.
What's the full title again?
Al-Lu'lu' wal-Murjan فيما اتفق عليه الشيخان. The pearls and the coral of what the two sheikhs, meaning Imams, Bukhari and Muslim, have agreed upon. Right? Imam Muslim, though, was more. 5 more minutes. Right, I'm going to conclude with this, inshallah. Imam Muslim was more artistic, actually, in the classification. It's just like, you have two scholars, but someone has a better website. So, right? So this is what Imam Muslim was. He was more advanced, probably had more softwares available, and now he had an easier, actually, book to track. The way he wrote it, what they call صنعته أحسن, meaning better technicality. But still, scholars agree that the overall benefit from Sahih al-Bukhari is way actually more than what you had in the Sahih Muslim, and that's why Sahih Bukhari still has actually more prominent value over the Sahih Muslim, but both together are considered the most authentic books after the Book of Allah. When you say اتفق عليه الشيخان, usually, or متفق عليه, it's usually narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Then we move on to the books of Sunnah. That's Sunnah, Abi Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, wa Ibn Majah. Can I pause here, inshallah? We can either finish after Salah or next Halaqa, inshallah. Whichever you like. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله والحمد لله رب العالمين. If you have any questions, go for it.
What were the 8 matters that you said makes comprehensive?
العقيدة والأحكام والسير والسنن والفتن والمناقب. So that's the beliefs, the laws, the rituals, the tribulations, the seer, the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and the manaqib, meaning the virtues that the Prophet ﷺ was described of or he mentioned of others. So when you include all these things, that's what makes a book comprehensive. And that's what Sahih al-Bukhari had. There are many other jami', like also Musannaf Abdul Razzaq, for example, is considered jami'. Musannaf Abdul Razzaq is a humongous, actually one of the biggest books, right? And it has all these things. Whereas Musnad al-Imam Ahmad, Musnad al-Imam Ahmad, we're going to talk about it, had 40,000 hadith plus. But that wasn't his classification. He started, we're going to talk, what the Ashra al-Mubashirin narrated by the companions. A, B, C, D, just went through 904 companions. What each one narrated, right? And that was basically Musnad, rendered to the companion. You see now, it's only technical difference in classifying the hadith.
Can we continue Q&A after the Salah?
Sure. We're good. Right. inshallah we'll finish after the salah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So, the second famous category in the books of scholars is what we call the books of Sunnah. And the four famous ones, there are many of them, but the most famous is Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah. There is also, just, you don't have to remember these things, but like Sunan Sa'id ibn Mansur, Ad-Darimi, Ad-Darqutni, and Al-Bayhaqi. So these are all Sunnahs, many, many books, but the most famous are these four that I mentioned. So that's why scholars say, when we say the five books, what are the five books?
Bukhari, Muslim,
Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood,
Tirmidhi,
Tirmidhi, Nasa'i.
Nisa'i.
When we say the six books, you can either add Ibn Majah or Musnad al-Imam Ahmad. And there are the 9 books. You add Muwatta al-Imam Ahmad to them. Muwatta al-Imam Malik, Musnad al-Imam Ahmad, Ibn Majah. So that's basically, these are the fundamental books of the Hadith that continue most of what you should know, or the most comprehensive collection of the Hadith. So let's talk briefly about the Sunnah. The Sunnah, as we mentioned, they're really classified based on the topics of fiqh. And the most authentic one amongst them is the Nasa'i, meaning had the most authentic collection actually. In these books of Sunnah, they did not limit it to authentic. They also had Hasan, which is the lower level, and they even had some Da'if, just so you know. So when you refer like to Hadith as Bukhari, blindly you can say it's authentic. Same thing for Muslim. Same thing for Muwatta Imam Malik, right? But when it comes to the Sunnah, you have to know, is this really authentic or not? Does that make sense? Then we move to the book of Imam Ahmad, the Musnad. So we spoke about Muwatta Imam Malik, about Bukhari, Muslim, briefly about the Sunnah, and now totally different classification style, that is Musnad Imam Ahmad, the book of Imam Ahmad. Imam Ahmad has a lot of prominence, as you know, because he is one of the most famous scholars of fiqh also throughout history. Imam Sunnah. He was dubbed as Imam Sunnah for a reason. We're going to talk about it, inshallah. And he was born in the year of 161 or 164 actually of Hijrah, and passed away in 241. So that, how much is that? That's 70 some years, basically. So Imam Ahmad, as you know, was in Iraq. And one of his famous teachers was Shafi'i. So he studied with most of the elite scholars. He started seeking the hadith very early on. And when he would get up for the hadith, he would wake up very early. To a point he mentions in one of the books, قال ولربما أردت الخروج أو التبكير في طلب الحديث فتمسك بي أمي إلى أن يطلع الفجر أو تطلع الشمس. He would get up early during the night to get out to the masjid when his teacher started to start hadith, studying hadith. So, and try to sneak out of the house and his mom would hold him back. Till when? Till Fajr times comes. So imagine how early he was, subhanAllah. Or sunrise. Yani this is subhanAllah. Yani that gives you that dedication. How much yani love for that? He started doing this when he was 7, 9. So this is why yani later on you know that when he had this hadith, again 40,000 hadith, out of 750,000 hadith he had in memorization or writing. It has to be noted though, when we say 750, many of these hadiths are like repeated or different narrations, or could be quotes after the Sahaba, but they're all classified as hadith. Still, that's a massive number. And they obviously have the authentic, the less authentic, the weak, and some of that. Some even maybe not fabricated hadith could be. But this is how much, yani, it was like an encyclopedia, subhanAllah, during that time. So what he did, he tracked all the hadith and rendered them to the companions who narrated that. So he started by the Ashra al-Mubashirin bil Jannah, right? The 10 companions, then based yani, on the virtues of the Sahaba, and he went through 904 Sahabi. Some of them maybe just narrated one of the hadith, but he went through over 900 Sahabi, what each one has narrated, and was able to collect over 40,000 hadith. That's why some scholars say book of Imam Ahmad has all the hadith. Truly not, but yani more or less 40,000 hadith is a lot of hadith. 10,000 hadith were repeated again. Because what was narrated by Abu Hurairah probably was narrated by Abdullah ibn Amr again. So there is like overlap and redundancy of about 10,000 hadith. Right? Imam Ahmad radiallahu anhu did not actually finish writing this book. So he did not complete it the way he wanted. So there were some gaps. So his son Abdullah finished it after his death. Abdullah, a lot of times read Abdullah bin Ahmad. That's Abdullah, the son of Imam Ahmad, who was muhaddith. He was also a very credible scholar, but obviously he was overshadowed by his dad. His reputation was not as big as his dad. So Abdullah is the one who finished it, and that's why actually you see Imam Ahmad would not include hadith da'if, but after that, like his son Abdullah included actually this authentic hadith, and that's why scholars after that came and critiqued it and made sure that they identified what belonged and what does not belong. But again, because Imam Ahmad, part of it, subhanAllah, why didn't he finish it? Anyone knows? Because he was in jail a lot, in and out, during the Abbasis, during Al-Ma'mun and Al-Mu'tasim. He was on and off because that Al-Fitna of Khalq al-Quran, which went in history as the issue of creating the Quran, which is right or not right. And it was it was a philosophical issue which many scholars overlooked. It's like not a big deal. Imam Ahmad stood firm, because if this went actually unnoticed and uncriticized, it could be a bid'ah that goes on in the minds of Muslims, and that would be a gate for other bid'ahs, and no one would be able to stop it. So he stood up firm, actually, where some of his contemporary scholars, like his friend Yahya bin Ma'in, was muhaddith, actually, said, no, I'm not going to bother. Shafi'i fled Iraq, for example, and went to Egypt. And but he actually went to jail, was tortured, actually. And that fitna lasted for about 16 years. It was on and off. He would be in jail, and I'm not even going to tell you how he was tortured, because I don't want this creative way of torturing to be transmitted to Guantanamo or Syria, because these people always look for some creative ways of torturing people, like waterboarding is not enough. Do you know the sticks of bamboo sticks? They would peel him off. They would put him on his body and slide him. And what would they do? Like cuts, right? Wounds all over. And then they would put salt on that. That was Imam Ahmad. And what he would say, oh Allah, make the Mu'tasim prevail in Amuri. During that torture. The Mu'tasim did not conquer Amuriya because of his heroism, it was because of the dua of Imam Ahmad. Now you know how Amuriya was conquered. Amuriya is like the Mu'tasim, the one he conquered. It was close to the part in Soviet when that woman, the Muslim woman, was harassed in the market and said, Wadu Qasima. And then the Mu'tasim said, I'm going to come with an army. Starts with Amuriya and comes, ends in Baghdad. And he went and conquered Amuriya. It was close to Armenia, basically. So it was, at that time, was kind of Turkish, Armenian. And so why? Because of the dua, Imam Ahmad. So imagine that, subhanAllah. And so this is why he became Imam of Sunnah. It wasn't just because he had a PhD in Hadith or something. It was deep dedication. It was sincere devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was unimaginable adherence to the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Unimaginable sacrifice. Who would have put up with that? It would have been easy just to flirt and go to a different country, just like the Shafi'i did. Or Yahya bin Ma'in, who said, you know what, I'm not going to worry. This is, he said, is just going to die. So Imam Ahmad, because of that, he had obviously interruption from his academic effort in his authoring the books and that. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him long life, 70 some years, and he had that massive number of hadith, obviously, one of the unparalleled actually collection of the hadith in history. So that is Musnad al-Imam Ahmad. And again, so many Musnad came after him to copy that effort. But again, some scholars said the book of Imam Ahmad is it, basically. Let's say if you want to educate your life, just you want to know what should I read in order to what I think I've really read the hadith of the Prophet, that would be it. So we're going to stop here, inshallah, so we don't go much longer. And if you have any questions, we'll address that. If not, inshallah, we'll meet in a couple of weeks.
I had a question. So you said Shaykh, Muttafaqun alayh means Bukhari and Muslim agreed upon it. And so that implies there were...
Akhrajahu al-Shaykhan, same story.
So that implies that there were some that they disagreed on.
No, not they disagreed, but this hadith was collected by both.
Or that there was overlap.
Yeah, exactly. Muttafaqun alayhi, this is a great question, jazakallah khair. Muttafaqun alayhi and overlap. Right? It doesn't mean they disagreed with others, but each one had effort in some of them. Because, like I said, what they included in their books, what they thought would be the most important hadith. So some, and they're all good hadith. It's not like, what Imam Bukhari included and what Muslim did not was more important or not, but it was what do I need, just like I'm giving you today in this lecture, what do I need to give you as what I think is important for you to know? You get a different speaker and he might give you total different story. But in this particular like place and time situation, I think this is what is relevant. Imam Bukhari was thinking in a comprehensive way. What is relevant to Muslims? And he included this hadith. Muslim was thinking in a different way. And they had some minor technical differences in the way they collected the hadith. So they overlapped in some, right? And they did not in others, right?
And will we be covering just like definitions of the stations of the hadith?
Inshallah, that's going to be series 2.
Just does mutafaqun alayh, is it like mutawatir? Is it like wahi basically, or is there such thing as if you disbelieve in one of the hadith that's paramount to kufr? Or I don't know if that's too complex of a question.
No, that's a very good question actually. Denying an authentic hadith is a bid'ah. It's a serious matter. Because if scholars agreed on it as a hadith, then you cannot object to it. There's any authentic hadith actually. It's a very serious stepping out the boundaries of the Sunnah. Basically, that's denying the Sunnah of the Prophet. And denying of the Sunnah is the bid'ah. قلنا السنة عكسها البدعة. Either Sunnah or bid'ah, right? Some people might question the authenticity. Then we said, okay, well, let's check it out, right? But when it is proven to be authentic, there is no room. Some people might have misunderstanding of what the hadith means, and scholars have talked about this, right? Often people misunderstand the hadith, misinterpret it, and they say, okay, well, it doesn't make sense, right? Well, it does make sense, but you may not understand exactly what it means. And that is related to the Imam, because when you know, even in the Quran, you can apply the same thing to the Quran, right? You might read something, oh, it doesn't make sense. Well, this is exactly what the wahi is. It's not that your mind is incapable of just comprehending everything, and that's why you need it. Because in the beginning we said the wahi is the Quran and it is the Sunnah also. So denying the Sunnah is denying the wahi. So long it is authentic, so long it is approved and agreed upon, then it is part of the wahi, undoubtedly.
So because the Sunan in the Musnad have Da'if Hadith, are only Muslim and Bukhari used in actually coming with rulings?
No, that is, they would have different ones. So if I tell you a hadith of Bukhari, I don't have to tell you it is sahih. It becomes redundant. But when I'm narrating a hadith for you in the book of Nisa'i, I have to tell you what level it is. So some of them are authentic, some are less. Does that make sense? But you cannot just say, okay, Nisa'i doesn't count. And as a matter of fact, believe it or not, the books of Sunan for students of knowledge are more helpful and applicable than the Jawami, because they're more variant and they're more artistic in their classification, actually. But then you have to have that basically profound sense on what's sahih and what is not. And it doesn't take much, it does take much. I mean, it just comes, it's a talent comes by, you acquire just by training like anything else. Just like, you know, what you do in your profession. You do training and you become competent. Same thing with that. It's an art, subhanAllah. You look at the hadith, and sometimes you would know exactly if it's sahih or not by reading so many hadith, by knowing what they are, by listening to that over and over. What else? 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll stop here. Jazakumullah.
Wa alaikum salam.